Welcome to the Friday Forum for April 11th, 2025. This is the 228th Friday Forum in a series hosted by ICLR, the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. We are Canada's leading source for disaster resilience knowledge. Each month, we present recently completed research related to ICLR's mission to make Canada more resilient to natural disasters. I'm your host, Dr. Keith Porter, ICLR's Chief Engineer. I'm speaking to you from London, Ontario, traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapeewak, and Chinootan nations. If you joined us last month, you heard Dr. Charles Scawthorne present the last in a mini-series of 3 Friday 4 webinars about fire. Next month, on May 9th, Professor Matthew Bourbonnais of the University of British Columbia will present research on real-time monitoring and prediction of wildfire risk for response and mitigation. Remember that you can find recordings and the speakers' decks for all of our Friday Fora at www.iclr.org/workshops. Today, we change gears and think about how to reduce Canada's growing flood risk. Dr. Shaieree, Cottar, Professor Brent Doberstein, and Sharmalene Mendis-Millard of the University of Waterloo are going to talk to us about managed retreat and home buyouts. Here's the aspect of this story that particularly interests me. Flood risk management has a fundamental problem that other natural hazards don't. With wind, earthquake, wildfire, and many other perils, experts like me can sit in our offices and we can write a building code. And if people follow that code, it can pretty effectively manage risk to new buildings. And we can do that because we can make maps of the hazards that affect these buildings, and we can make those maps at a resolution on the order of kilometers. But flood risk varies over meters. Couple of meters can make a big difference. Now, until last year, we didn't even have the geospatial maps to begin to do that. Last June, we did get a bunch of high-resolution LiDAR maps so that code writers could, with those maps, begin to create building codes to better manage flood risk. And maybe going forward, we can do a better job of managing flood risk to new buildings. But there's this vast body of existing buildings that are currently in harm's way. A small fraction of those buildings represent an enormous fraction of the nation's flood risk. We have to figure out how to handle those buildings. Our speakers today are going to address a big part of that problem. Sharmalene Mendis-Millard, who is the Director of Partners for Action at the University of Waterloo. Dr. Brent Doberstein is an Associate Professor at the University of Waterloo's Department of Geography. And Dr. Shaieree Cottar is a Research Associate with Partners for Action. Together, they study policies related to recovery and resilience. Before I turn it over to our speakers, here's our agenda. Our webinar is going to last 90 minutes. Our speakers present for about half that time, then I'm going to moderate questions for the rest of the time. Please feel free to chat your questions into the Q&A box. I'll try to pose your questions in the order that they appear in the Q&A box. If we have a lot of questions, I may only pose your first question, then I'll move on to others, then I'll circle back to your additional questions. Our webinar is recorded, and ICLR is going to post the slides and a link to the video by Monday or so. So if you have colleagues who couldn't attend, let them know. You'll find the video and a PDF of our speakers' decks at www.iclr.org/workshops. And now I'll turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you so much, Keith, and to ICLR for having us today. And thank you all for joining us. Again, my name is Sharmalene Mendis-Millard from Partners for Action at the University of Waterloo's Faculty of Environment. So we're very pleased to share some of what we've learned over the years about managed retreat and property buyouts as a tool for strategic relocation. Next slide, please. So I will briefly just introduce us at Partners for Action if you don't know us, and then turn it over to Brent and Shaieree to talk about managed retreat as a whole, as a concept, how it's been applied in different jurisdictions, and then we'll move on to things about funding and what we have found through our different studies. Next slide, please. So given the topic today, I just wanted to acknowledge that the colonial history of forced relocation that continues to impact Indigenous and First Nations communities today. The process of relocation to reserves did not respect their right to self-determination, the deep connections to the land and waters, or allow for traditional practices, such as being able to move to safer ground seasonally during flood season, for example. First Nation communities in Canada continue to be disproportionately affected by flooding and other climate hazards. They're more likely to be evacuated or face long-term displacement compared to non-Indigenous communities. And especially our northern and remote rural communities are often under-resourced and experience infrastructure deficits, further impacting their ability to adapt to a changing climate and to access services. So when thinking about managed retreat, we want to be mindful of considering the ways in which flood risks are inequitably distributed because of where people live and the access to services that they have, to be sensitive to how we're approaching this topic with affected communities, and especially our Indigenous communities that were forcibly relocated, and to listen and learn from knowledge and rights holders in the territories we work in. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're a research initiative in the Faculty of Environment. We were created with founding sponsorship from cooperators and Farm Mutual Re to empower Canadians to be flood resilient through climate adaptation, climate action, such as awareness and preparedness, and climate justice through taking an equity lens to risk assessments and mapping, for example. In more recent years, we've focused on multi-hazard resilience as things do interact and worked against each other and work with each other. Next slide, please. You might know us from Flood Smart Canada, one of our early initiatives that was groundbreaking in providing resources to businesses, communities, and others in a community engaged way with links to flood maps in one place where people could access them. Next slide. And more recently, we've built upon that work with a new site called Climate Resilient Retrofits that gives you what to do, what measures to take to adapt to floods, fire, ice and snow, and extreme wind, and how those measures might interact with one another. So you can think about multiple hazards at the same time when you're planning and providing incentives or thinking about what you want to encourage in communities. Next slide, please. Another bucket of work falls under the inclusive resilience area with risk mapping that includes a social vulnerability index for equity-informed decision-making and prioritization. So please do visit our website for that work that was founded or sponsored by Canadian Red Cross and cooperators. Next slide, please. But for now, we're focusing on strategic relocation as one adaptation strategy that communities are increasingly considering. And so what I'd really like you to do and invite you to do now is to please take out your phones or log into menti.com and you can see the code there. We'd like to hear from you about your knowledge of this topic, just so we get a sense of who's in the room and what experience you've had with managed retreat. So I'll just give you a minute to please access the Menti, and then I'll move on to the question. Okay, I think everyone has had a chance. All right. Okay, so the question is, how much do you know about the concept of managed retreat, also known as strategic or planned relocation, and sometimes known as property buyouts, which I mentioned in the intro, really is a tool for relocation. Okay, so we've got people on the 2.6 out of 5 scale. So mostly in the middle here. Not a little, not a lot, like Goldilocks, maybe just right. Okay. Thank you. All right, so now I'll pass it over to Brent to give you an overview of the concept and how it's been applied. Take it away, Brent. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sharmalene. So firstly, I guess my goal for the next 10 to 15 minutes is to move that bar to the right on the Menti. Just checking that you can see my slides. Okay, so this image right here was taken in Point Gatineau in 2019 at the height. Yep.
We can actually see your presenter view.
Okay, I will.
Yeah, we don't want to give anything away.
Yeah, I actually have no notes linked to that. This is a new one for me. Okay, let me just try this again. Okay, I think I know how to solve this. Is that still presenter notes?
Yes.
How about that? Nope.
Yep,
Perfect.
we're good to go.
Okay. Okay, so this image right here, taken at the height of the flood stage in 2019. This was May 1st in Point Gatineau. And this is a community that has faced repeat flooding over its lengthy history, 140 to 150 years of existence. But the most recent flood history in 2017 and 2019 led to managed retreat and home buyouts. And that's why I'm using this as a starting point. I'm just going to give you a very quick primer on managed retreat. We've gone through a little bit of the terminology that's used already, but I'll just give you a definition that we tend to use both in our publications and our research. I think, give you an overview of why I think there's been increasing interest in managed retreat here in Canada and other countries, and give you a very much a snapshot view of managed retreat in Canada, how it's been applied over the past 10 years, and perhaps some of the changes that we're starting to detect in the way that managed retreat is being applied. And then end off with a quick discussion about what I'm considering to be innovative funding approaches. They may not be really far outside the box in terms of innovation, but innovation in terms of some deviations from the norm. And that's really how I wanted to frame that. I'll also give you just a quick overview of a research project that's based here at Waterloo involving 3 countries' experiences with managed retreat. So our definition is the purposeful, coordinated relocation of people, property, and critical infrastructure out of areas vulnerable to recurrent climatic hazards. And I would say our bias within our research is the climatic hazards. So you could easily take the word climatic out of that definition and also encompass geophysical hazards, for example. But we're mostly focused on climatic hazards. And we see multiple synonyms for both of the 2 key words. So managed, planned, strategic. We see different organizations and different publications using those different terms. And then retreat is sometimes substituted with either relocation or resettlement, depending on community wishes for the most part. And this term managed is not always front and center. And some of that is for a very strategic decision to avoid the issue of who is actually the puppet master of managed retreat, who is steering this process, or from some community perspectives, who is doing this to our community. So we sometimes see the terms community retreat or community relocation, just no sense of management there, or just the term buyouts, which is very, management neutral. And we often see different terms for being used for linear infrastructure, especially coastal defenses and dikes, where the term managed realignment is more common. But maybe this is a little bit of my own confirmation bias, but I'm seeing more and more publications in popular media about managed retreat, questioning whether this is the next step that we as a society need to take to stay on top of climatic hazards or changing hazards. And it's certainly not limited to Canada or even North America. We're seeing the applications of managed retreat in multiple countries around the world, including Indonesia. So it seems like a concept that was talked about previously, but now seems to be actually seriously considered as a climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction approach. This graph here, or graphic here, is basically research on the literature on managed retreat, both popular literature and academic literature. And you can see a dramatic increase. I would say the inflection point is around 2010, where we saw both academic publications and popular media publications spiking in interest. And anybody who's old enough to remember the 2010 to 2015 period, you might remember some very high-profile disasters that led to discussions about managed retreat. Hurricane Sandy, for example, or the flooding in Western Canada in Alberta. At the same time, as we continue on with disaster accounting, we see just a steady increase in the rising costs of disaster. And we see these mega disasters that are, when the final accounting is done, it's in the multi-billions of dollars for a single event. And then, of course, the recovery costs built into that. So there's just an understanding that the disaster costs are beginning to overwhelm our capacity to pay for that. And at the same time, our traditional reliance on structural protection, engineered approaches to protect us from hazards, is beginning to cost us more and more money. So we see this homeowner on the right-hand side who is facing very dire consequences if they don't continue to dump money over the cliff that's eroding directly underneath them, and at the same time potentially appealing to the local municipality to help with those payments. And so it's costing much, much more to try and protect against these primary hazards and even the secondary impacts of protection, perhaps triggering erosion in neighboring properties. That's beginning to be accounted for and maybe considered to be not acceptable anymore. And then on top of that, we're layering on climate change effects, and we're seeing differences in the way hazards are playing out in our communities. In some cases, perhaps increasing magnitudes of hazard-related disasters, or changing seasonality, or more repetition. And we're also beginning to see changing approaches to insurance, where traditionally insurance would try to make homeowners who have experienced disaster whole again. And I think that's some of the insurance language that I understand. Whereas now there are some companies and some changes in the insurance industry where instead of asking homeowners to rebuild in the place that they just suffered losses, perhaps some of those insurance payouts can now be used to relocate to safer locations. But I think overall, it's just this realization, and it's a slow, steady realization that we should not treat as normal the idea that we have disasters, we respond, we rebuild, we recover, we experience another disaster, and we know that that will continue on ad nauseum into the future, adding costs in every cycle. So the realization that retreat may cost less than rebuilding in place. So here's a little bit of a, it's a single slide snapshot of how managed retreat over the last 10 to 15 years has played out in Canada. Almost every one of the cases that we can find where managed retreat has been part of the response or part of the approach to risk reduction is reactive to disaster. And a lot of that is flood hazard dominated. We have actively looked for examples of proactive managed retreat, and we find it's very rare. In some cases related to geophysical hazards, maybe that are more predictable in a probability sense, and where we're seeing evidence that if we continue to allow homeowners to stay in a location of geophysical risk, it's just a matter of time when those homeowners will be affected. I don't think proactive retreat it's being talked about and considered in relation to flood hazard, but it's a very difficult conversation to begin to say we need to retreat 30 years ahead of the flood hazard that we're expecting under climate change. But those conversations are beginning to be had in terms of municipal climate change adaptation. When we look at cases of managed retreat across Canada, we do see that for the most part, it's a provincial or even municipal responsibility, usually in reaction to disaster. And for that reason, it seems as though each one of these managed retreat cases at the municipal level, it almost seems to be starting from square one or starting without a standardized playbook. Each province, territory, or municipality basically creates their own approach. And some of that can be actually quite positive if it's being contextual for that community that's being impacted. But in other cases, we find quite a bit of variation between one case and another in all sorts of areas where perhaps there might be a better approach towards standardization. So it does seem like each disaster triggers a novel approach. And although research has now come up with a broad range of what you might call best practices or positive approaches for managed retreat, we find, especially because managed retreat is so reactive to disaster, it's almost as if there's not enough time to implement best practices in the midst of an unfolding disaster recovery process or project. And we sometimes find some best practices are being used, others are not being used, or they're even unknown by designers who are not managed retreat specialists. They're just implementing this approach in their community. And unlike the United States, Canada has no standing managed retreat funding program, no constant program that is just waiting around for people to apply for funding. The only province that continues to have a standing managed retreat program is Quebec, or at least the last time I looked. It's a changing landscape, but it seems that only Quebec has still had these approaches in place, waiting for the next use. And overall, I would say the use of managed retreat is severely constrained by lack of consistent funding. And so in the midst of an unfolding disaster, that's where municipalities, provinces are trying to pull together enough funding to implement a managed retreat program. These are some of the typical sources of funding. Certainly the federal level is playing a role. Usually managed retreat case studies or cases that we've looked at have been cost shared between federal government, provincial, and municipalities. I would say that's the norm for managed retreat in Canada, to have a cost sharing approach. And at the federal level, we do have the DMAF, or Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund, that municipalities can apply to as one source of funding that might fund some of their managed retreat actions. And starting this April, or starting now, our Disaster Financial Aid Arrangements, or DFAA program, is changing to potentially allow more proactive approaches to risk reduction. So the federal government will continue to be involved in funding managed retreat, as will provinces. But as I mentioned already, some insurance companies are beginning to allow disaster payouts to be used for relocation. Unfortunately, this is our basic formula here in Canada: wait for disaster. In the midst of an unfolding disaster recovery program, scrambling just to keep things moving along, maybe not taking the time to connect that managed retreat to longer-term community climate change resilience planning. So we could make a more proactive approach if we start from community climate change resilience planning and then consider managed retreat within that. So we wait for disaster strikes, we scramble to design a managed retreat program, scrambling to find funding, and that funding lack or the funding restrictions often guide the eventual managed retreat program. There's not much that you can do without significant funding. And then with whatever funding we manage to pull together in a post-disaster environment, we implement managed retreat. And sometimes that's limited, sometimes that's more expansive, sometimes there are some supports for homeowners who might be bought out, and in other cases, a much more market-driven approach is being used. I think generally most homeowners would say that they have not received the full support that they hoped while going through the managed retreat project, and that there's more work that could be done on supporting homeowners as the project unfolds. And then, unfortunately, because of all these limitations, municipalities face criticism because they are not perhaps implementing the best managed retreat project that could be implemented if more time and more funding was available. This is just a map showing past and current managed retreat cases in Canada. And we're continuing to discover more and more cases all the time because some of these projects are not actually using the terms managed retreat or buyouts for flood risk reduction. In some cases, it's a municipal acquisition for other elements of municipal goals and visions. There are only 2 cases that we can point to directly where there are proactive elements, where retreat is being carried out before it's being implemented or before disaster has struck. So these are the 2 cases here, Tuktoyaktuk and Cooksville Parkland, Mississauga. And we're finding in almost every case where managed retreat has either been considered or could be considered in case of a flood disaster, that there's active unmanaged retreat that's going on to homeowners who have lived through the flood disaster, perhaps even received an insurance payout, and then they're on selling their property a few years later, often with some nice renovation features. So I don't want to pick on any one homeowner. This was just an announcement for Constance Bay in 2019, where all the residences between the 536 and 1062 Bayview Drive area were evacuated due to floodwater levels. And then several years later, one of those residences was sold, and that's right in the middle of that evacuation zone. So the homeowner is simply waiting for the right time when there's no water in the community and retreating from risk without any kind of outside management. This is another case. This is Merritt, BC, and this is just a standard real estate map showing properties that are for sale, and this was yesterday. If I then overlay a map, an inundation map from 2021, and unfortunately it's a little bit grainy, you can see where these properties are located vis-a-vis the inundation that happened in 2021. So all of the red circled properties were inundated to a certain level, or at least the neighborhood was. And now all of these homes are up for sale. Okay, before I go on to my discussion of innovative funding, we have another Menti poll, and I'm going to stop sharing so we can share that poll with you. And it's basically looking at this issue of funding mechanisms.
Thanks, Brent. So yes, everyone, please put your creative hats on and let us know what funding arrangements, especially novel or innovative ones, have you heard about for managed retreat or home buyout programs. We'd love to hear from you. Federal disaster relief, none. Use of stormwater rates, interesting. Huh. For managed retreat, and I would be interested in that. I wouldn't think that there would be enough out of those rates. DFA and DFAA. Blue Acres, I've never heard of that one. Whoops. This is what happens when you have a touch screen. And then how do I scroll down here? Prearranged financing to be enacted upon a disaster occurring.
That's an interesting one.
Quebec got no.
Yeah, I've recently read about that. It's basically a threshold approach.
So it's in place, and then if something's triggered, you get it right away.
Yeah, and I believe that's a form of insurance policy as well, where you purchase insurance and the payout is conditional on reaching a certain threshold, which could be a flooding threshold, it could be a damage threshold.
Parametric insurance.
Parametric.
That's an interesting. I've heard of that for nature-based solutions, but not necessarily for this. One and done insurance. Go ahead. One and done insurance to discourage those expensive renovations. So you basically don't get insured after you're flooded. Is that what that means?
I think it's a capping approach. Yeah, you get a single payout. The interesting question there is whether you could take that payout to do something as an alternative to renovation, basically turning your back on your flooded home and taking the payout to fund your own relocation.
City of Portland willing seller. I don't know what that is.
Willing seller, interesting.
Victoria case study. Insurance rising if you stay in a floodplain. Yes, a disincentive.
Right.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much.
Well, this is a constant learning process, and thank you for adding in a few others that we now have to have a look at. I'll go back to sharing. Just to make sure I'm showing the right slide.
You'll have to swap the slides, Brent.
Okay, so it's a manual swap each time. Okay. Okay, so just quickly, what I'm considering to be innovative may not be innovative to everybody. I think what I'm saying here is that these funding sources might be able to push the needle a little bit from our standard reliance of being reactive to disaster to be able to be more proactive about managed retreat. And in some cases, these are just unusual, or they might be one-off approaches that might be present or possible in one location, but maybe not in all locations. So the three that I'll just quickly talk about are, firstly, development charges. Secondly, the DFAA program, which has just undergone some changes as of this April. And then thirdly, community climate resilience plans. So this was my previous slide, just showing typical sources of funding. And so the innovations are going to be a little bit outside of these typical sources, or maybe combinations. So the first example is from Cooksville Parkland in Mississauga. And there's been a fairly lengthy conversation about this park, Cooksville Parkland, and the properties that back onto that park. And there's a creek running through, which tends to flood from time to time. And so there's been a long-term concern within Mississauga to try and reduce flood risks for property owners who back onto the creek that's flooding and the parkland itself. What we learned, though, is that as standard development charges in Mississauga, developers either must convey parkland to the city when they're developing a plot of land, say for a high-rise or a commercial development, or if they choose not to or can't because of design restrictions, they could pay cash in lieu of parkland that goes into a general city fund. And that's between that's a formula that's based on the value of the development, and it's quite complex, but there is a formula that exists that developers know about ahead of time. So they can make that choice as an informed choice by either modifying their development plan to give over the parkland or just paying for the right to avoid that. Where managed retreat comes in is about 2012, the city began to start discussing flood risk reduction. And they identified Cooksville Parkland properties, about 30 properties that backed onto the park, as being potentially targets or acquisition properties. They went through a comprehensive flood risk reduction planning process, basically ranking all the various alternatives from building protective structures to acquiring properties, and managed retreat was the least preferred alternative, so it was shelved. It then got resurrected 5 years later when the city wanted to make progress on expanding their green space. And so really they did a reframing of that project as parkland expansion. And that seemed to be very acceptable to the community, I think because it's linked with a very positive benefit. Community green space, community recreation, and part of a community climate resilience visioning plan is to build in more green space. So they took the parkland charges from this general fund, purchased 31 homes, or they're still in the process of purchasing some of those, and they're paying market value to the homeowners. There's no coercion other than asking if the homeowners would like to sell, and in some cases, planning when they would like to sell. At the same time, they also managed to avoid the structural mitigation measures that might have been needed to protect those properties. And that was a significant investment that is now avoided because they spent much less to acquire and retreat those properties. The second example, very new, from 1970 to about 2024, the Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangements Program at the federal level was designed to share the costs of disaster recovery. So after a disaster happened, provinces and territories could apply to DFAA to help out with the recovery costs. But managed retreat is not considered to be recovery. So really, it was not eligible for DFAA funding. That program went through a significant review and revision, and this month they're rolling out the new DFAA program. And I had a quick look through the revisions and wrote a quick opinion piece. You can have a look at that if you're interested in this. But essentially, they have modified the sole focus on recovery to now allow for disaster risk reduction or preventative actions. So I think there's an opportunity through this federal fund to target more proactive forms of disaster risk reduction, especially related to climate change and extreme weather risks. And this is just something that is buried in the appendix of the newly announced DFAA program. On the right-hand side, one of the 5 funding streams is designed to allow for disaster mitigation, strategic disaster mitigation and risk reduction before disaster. There's still a bit of language left over about how these funded actions might happen after disaster, but at least there is a more proactive, forward-looking view to this rather than just focusing on recovery. So that's the second of the 3 innovative funding approaches. And then the third, I've already mentioned, is what I'm just calling community climate resilience plans. And one example that we have researched is Surrey, where they were trying to proactively look at future coastal flooding that they anticipate will happen under climate change. And so from 2016 to 2019, they carried out a series of community engagement exercises, community visioning exercises, building in climate change scenarios and asking the community, okay, if you believe in what we think is going to happen, what would you like to do about it? So as part of that CFAS strategy of community engagement, they identified 13 climate change adaptation projects, all related to infrastructure. And in the process of identifying those 13 projects, they also put out for community consideration the idea of managed retreat in one of the communities within Surrey. Ultimately, the community decided to reject that option. That community was Crescent Beach. But because these conversations are ongoing and will likely be put back to the community, say 10 years from now, this could be brought back on the table as a potential strategy going forward. But for now, it's the 13 projects that had been submitted and were funded by the DMAF federal funding agency. And so $76 million was granted to Surrey for their flood adaptation strategy. So managed retreat could have fit into there. It just didn't happen to in this cycle. And now I'm going to hand off to Shaieree and stop sharing.
Probably unmute myself. There we go. Great. Thank you, Brent, for that wonderful overview of managed retreat in Canada. I just want to situate ourselves and give us an understanding of some jurisdictional differences that we have in Canada when it comes to the use of property buyouts. So where have property buyouts occurred in Canada? I think Brent did a really great job of actually highlighting some proactive versus reactive cases, but I wanted to highlight a tool that Partners for Action has developed, which is an interactive online web visualization tool that actually allows you to look at case studies across Canada. We have developed community profiles for distinct cases where we highlight the type of hazard, the scale of the scale of the disaster, the types of buyouts that occurred, whether it was land acquisition based for flood mitigation or if it was strictly for retreat purposes. We look at the number of properties that were actually bought out and what was done with the land post buyout. And we finally link it to long-term risk reduction measures if the community has implemented any. So I really encourage folks to check this tool out. It's a work in progress, but we've done a fairly great job of highlighting some documented case studies. So the next few slides, I'll highlight a couple of distinct case studies that we see across Canada, particularly because they've been documented and have a really robust data set when it comes to the types of buyouts that have occurred in these communities. So the first one being the city of Gatineau in the province of Quebec. So in the spring of 2017 and 2019, and even in 2023, we actually saw that the community experienced significant rainfall, rapid snowmelt, and soil saturation. The record-breaking floods actually forced more than 4,000 people to evacuate from the Ottawa River shoreline and damaged up to 1,800 properties. At the time, disaster assistance was quickly made available for eligible homeowners who had sustained damages only to their primary residences. But we also saw that provincial legislation prohibited the rebuilding of up to 1,500 flood damaged properties located in the 1 in 20-year flood zone, or now commonly referred to as the high-risk flood zone. So they used something called a special intervention zone to do that. At the time, the Provincial Disaster Financial Assistance Program actually targeted homes for a buyout with a capped value of $200,000 and an additional $50,000 for the value of the land. So to be eligible for a buyout, you either had to reach a damage threshold of $100,000 or higher, and that would enable you to then choose if you'd want to participate in a buyout or not. We also saw that the city of Gatineau, to accelerate recovery efforts, deferred property tax deadlines, waived application fees, expedited construction and demolition permits as well. And you can see in the pictures there, we have some vacant lots. So there's still a question as to what's happening with these vacant lots after the buyout process, given that some community members have chosen to stay in the community after the disaster. The next community I want to bring you back to on the West Coast is the city of Grand Forks in British Columbia. This community was heavily impacted by their 2018 floods. At the time, the province of British Columbia did not have a formal managed retreat policy, and to date still does not have any formal program or funding attached to that, despite efforts made by the BC Flood Strategy to actually give some guidance around community-led managed retreat. In the case of Grand Forks, we saw that the program was highly reactive, developed in the aftermath of the disaster. The buyout program actually lasted almost 2 years. All the properties that were included were typically located actually within the floodplain. They had a high number of low-income residents, rental properties, and seniors. This program is particularly unique because it was actually funded in a three-way cost-sharing agreement between the federal government, the province of BC, and the city of Grand Forks. Compensation in this community was particularly interesting because it was based on a post-flood value, which was really tied again to the amount of money granted for the program. So there were some funding stipulations and around how compensation was developed. As you can imagine, this was really highly controversial, especially since property owners got the impression that they would be getting pre-flood value. So there was a lot of speculation around what that would look like. And in order to make the offers more fair, they came up with a compensation formula which factored in things like disturbance damages and discretionary allotments. The program is described as voluntary, and they actually did have quite a high rate of voluntary uptakes of offers. One of the stipulations around the federal portion of the funding was that the land after it was bought out had to be rezoned as a floodplain. And so therefore, any properties or homeowners that did not actually pursue the buyout, they were still outstanding by the end of the buyout process, needed to be expropriated. So there was a couple of challenges around some of those properties as well. And so the program did get a lot of pushback for being, on the surface being described as voluntary, but because of the funding stipulations about rezoning the land, they needed to, essentially hit a target of 100% vacant rate so that they could actually move people out of the flood zone. So this was a particularly interesting case as well. And then finally, we looked at the town of High River, which is located 70 kilometers south of Calgary. It was hit particularly hard in 2013 when the floods actually impacted nearly 60% of the residences and 70% of the buildings. The town actually issued at the time a mandatory evacuation order for all 13,000 residences. 2 months after the flood, the government of Alberta announced again, an ad hoc program called the Floodway Relocation Program with an allocated budget of $137 million. The program really aimed to encourage certain homeowners in Calgary, High River, Medicine Hat, Bragg Creek, Black Diamond, and Turner Valley to voluntarily relocate out of the floodway. So we saw residential owners that were designated within the floodway zones were actually eligible to receive compensation equal to their most recent municipal tax assessment value in exchange for actually vacating and retreating from their homes. Of course, something that we've seen across all the case studies is that only primary residences were eligible for the program, and the government did not intend to allow any rebuilding on vacated lots after the fact. Those who declined the buyout and opted instead to receive financial disaster assistance actually forfeited eligibility to receive additional assistance in the event of a future flood. And we saw this as a stipulation in many of the cases, Gatineau being one of them. We also saw a lot of criticism and media outrage when it was directed at the provincial government for their flood relocation program because they actually relied on outdated flood hazard maps that didn't really consistently reflect areas where actual damage had occurred. So we saw instances where homes within the floodway, within the designated floodway, weren't actually damaged, and we saw other homes outside of the floodway were not eligible for a buyout, but had sustained significant damage. So there was a lot of inconsistency there when it came to some of the eligibility. We generally saw a low uptake across Alberta's floodway relocation program, about 40%, which actually prompted the province to extend the program, giving residents almost an extra full year to participate in the buyout program. And one thing that we've seen is timing is a critical factor when it comes to buyouts. And so usually it's enacted within the first 6 months. So giving folks an additional year after was really novel in this case. Notably, since then, the town of High River actually purchased back 14 properties from the province and returned them back to private ownership through an open bid process, as these homes were minimally damaged in the floods, and the town of High River spent and invested a lot of money into structural mitigation. And so they've deemed these properties as not in the low risk category now. The next case I want to highlight is a really emerging case that we're seeing. The case of Merritt in British Columbia, and this community was heavily impacted by the 2021 BC atmospheric river event, which actually forced mass evacuations for 7,000 people within the community. At the time, the municipal wastewater treatment plant actually had been fully inundated. Major highways that led into the community had also been washed away. So there was a lot of transportation issues as well. After the disaster, the City of Merritt developed a $154 million flood mitigation plan. And in that, they did a couple of things. They actually developed an options analysis, which they tabled to the community to show them options of if they were to engage in a full floodplain retreat, a partial floodplain retreat, a combination of structural and non-structural mitigation approaches to make the community more resilient to flood hazards in the future. So ultimately, through, as many of you know, you can have a plan, but if you don't have any funding to support that, you can't really go anywhere. So through a lot of funding, grants, applications, and proposals, the City of Merritt was actually able to receive funds to develop 2 dikes, approximately $60 million. The City of Merritt is also using buyouts to enable their flood mitigation plan, and they're doing this to actually purchase particular properties along the Coldwater River so that they can actually extend the footprint of the dike that they have there. In the backdrop of all of this, we still know that the province of British Columbia does not have a formal provincial managed retreat policy or program that allows for municipalities to directly tap into these funding sources or policies. I will pass it to Sharmalene to introduce our next section.
Thanks, Shaieree. All right, so now that you've learned a bit about what we found through P4A's research on managed retreat approaches across Canada and property buyouts and those experiences, we'll share highlights of 2 key reports that provide you guidance so that those of you who are wondering, where do I start if I want to consider how to practically apply these approaches in an evidence-based way? How do I build on the lessons learned from past experiences? This is what you can turn to. So the first report is Buying Out the Floodplain. In 2020, we set out to investigate what works and what doesn't in property buyout programs, drawing on lessons learned from the cases that Shaieree just went over. So at that time, recent and groundbreaking programs, buyout programs in Grand Forks, British Columbia, High River, Alberta, and Gatineau, Quebec. In this report, we highlight the trade-offs that governments must consider when designing new programs and the role of community stakeholders in shaping those programs, recognizing people are affected disproportionately and do need a say in what happens in their lives. This work aims to help communities across Canada reduce the risks and costs associated with flooding and strengthen their community's resilience as they face more extreme and frequent perils. So this report, I know, has been used by municipalities such as Halifax Regional Municipality when putting together a strategy and a brief to council. So it's a good overview and something that can guide your work moving forward. So I'll hand it back over to Shaieree to give you those highlights.
Thanks, Sharmalene. So given that I just kind of took you on a really accelerated comparative analysis of some of the case studies that we looked at, we also identified a set of evaluation criteria that we wanted to look at when we were evaluating these cases. So we identified 3 main challenges when it came to the implementation of buyout programs across Canada. And using these criteria, we're able to identify best practices and proposals actually to mitigate some of the difficulties. So the first criteria we looked at was cost efficiency. And really what this looked at was, are communities getting the best return on investment if they invested in buyouts as opposed to, structural mitigation? Are we using our resources wisely? Are we minimizing overlap and duplication when it comes to funding pots at the provincial level and perhaps the municipal level? The second evaluation criteria we were looking at was this idea of social acceptability. So are buyouts accepted by the general public, by program administrators? Is this something that people would actually buy into? When we are building out programs, was the program designed with accountability and transparency in mind? Was there a participatory component where program administrators or designers were able to work with community members in advance to build out a program that worked for the community? And finally, probably the most important evaluation criteria that we were able to look at was this idea of political feasibility. Was there support by elected officials and influential stakeholders when it actually came to building out a program? Was there the political will to do this? Oftentimes, but programs surpass the cycle of elected officials. So really, it was trying to see if that there was support beyond those political cycles as well. Using those design characteristics and those evaluation criteria, we really asked ourselves some following questions when it came to key program design considerations that were built out and that you can kind of take across any case study. So the first one being timing. So should buyouts really be pursued, in the proactive or reactive stance, after significant disaster or before disaster? And we're looking at the trade-offs between the efficiency and effectiveness. You're often more efficient if you're working at developing a program in the proactive environment, but it's most often effective when a disaster actually strikes and people see the damage that's actually happened on their property. One thing we found throughout a lot of our case studies was this idea of coerciveness. Majority of the cases we saw were voluntary, but there were elements of coerciveness that kind of led you to think that homeowners may be inclined to take a buyout offer now instead of 5 years in the future. So this idea of should buyouts be voluntary or mandatory, and really the trade-off here was this between social acceptability and the effectiveness of the program. It's more acceptable that it's voluntary, but it's if you're looking through a mitigation standpoint, if you're able to get 100% of homeowners in a high-risk zone to relocate, that makes the program effective. And again, this depends on the program's goals. Compensation is probably the most important factor that homeowners are interested in. So should property owners be offered pre-flood market value, or should compensation be capped? And we saw amongst all three case studies that different compensation formulas were used, but this really gets to the idea that we're really trying to figure out the trade-offs between efficiency and social acceptability. If you're offering pre-flood market value, homeowners may be more inclined to participate in the program because they're getting market value for their house, as opposed to a capped compensation, which may not reflect market value. And finally, this idea of governance. So what is the respective role of different tiers of governments when it actually came to the development and implementation of buyout programs? So maybe one authority was in charge of developing and designing the policy, and another authority may be in charge of implementation, or vice versa. So we took our evaluation criteria, we took our design characteristics, and we looked at our 3 different case studies, and we started to rank them based on high, medium, and low. And so we came up with a couple of findings. In each of the 3 case studies, we found that communities recognized that reducing exposure to future flood risk was actually really worth the investment. Each community really tried to align the buyouts with a longer-term strategy for risk reduction, which further enhanced the program's benefits. So we saw some communities align it with their climate adaptation plans. They aligned their flood mitigation plans with their future official community plans. So really finding the alignment of policies so that you're minimizing the duplication of plans in the future. We really saw inefficiencies in the actual program administration and implementation, and that we can accredit back to when programs are built in the aftermath or the reactive nature of it. These are ad hoc programs, and so it's really hard to massage out the kinks of these programs when you've never implemented something before. So the first time is always going to be a challenge. In both the cases of High River and Gatineau, provinces and municipalities actually took on responsibilities that required time to coordinate in ways that delayed access to critical information and funding for residences, which actually led to confusion. The buyout programs performed the poorest when it came to social acceptability. And of course, we know that this outcome is not surprising, given that the disruption and difficulty following the flood, convincing property owners to abandon their homes is quite harsh and critical. And so we actually saw that property owners experienced significant delays in confirming whether they should be rebuilding or were eligible for a buyout after the disaster. So there was this, given the time lag and the confusion, sometimes we saw particular cases where waiting up to 6 months after the fact where they didn't know if they were going to be eligible for a buyout or not. One thing that we saw that the buyout programs were all considered largely politically feasible because they had political support. These were highly publicized in the media. We saw elected officials come out advocating for the program. So we know that this outcome is especially important since a lot of the existing research identifies local political opposition as a major barrier to this policy option. So this is a key finding that came out of this report. One thing also we saw that is a part of the political support is explained by the trauma that's caused by the disaster and the recognition in the community that rebuilding completely is not an appropriate strategy anymore. So we saw that, and that's really a narrative and cultural shift that we saw in many of these communities as well, especially communities like Gatineau, which face subsequent floods year after year. And so really it hit home for a lot of the homeowners that maybe this isn't the best place to live anymore. So we were able to come up with a set of recommendations. The first one being property buyout programs are or really should be developed in advance of a disaster and be made available for proactive or reactive implementation. So you got to do the pre-disaster recovery work so that proactive buyout programs can be more cost efficient, engage a wider set of stakeholders, and actually facilitate a more systemized rollout. We saw delays in outreach limited the social acceptability of the program by leading to higher levels of mistrust amongst residences. So in some cases, information that was released through the media would often be contradictory or unclear, leading to confusion about eligibility or compensation levels, which actually gave more work back to the administrating authority to kind of clear up some of that confusion. So developing a communication strategy that actually maintains a single source of constantly available information can actually improve program uptake. We found that adequate engagement requires human and administrative resources at the local level. We found disaster survivors really required significant support and assistance to understand the program's requirements and to actually navigate the buyout application process, given that, you know, most of us who are engaging in a buyout, it's probably going to be our first time doing this. And we found that the provision of the on-the-ground support and resources can actually help to humanize the application process, improve processing times, and actually ensure that residences have access to the resources required for successful program implementation. One thing, like as noted before, we know that compensation is really dicey. And so by increasing the ceiling of compensation, homeowners are incentivized to participate and are granted greater financial flexibility to relocate, hopefully by purchasing a home nearby or in a comparable market. We found that a lot of folks wanted to stay within a 25-kilometer radius of where they originally lived. So finding something in a comparable market was really important. We also found that market values differ based on location. So obviously regional compensation caps should be set so that homeowners are provided enough funds to cover existing mortgages. Municipal governments should also engage local community organizations in the development of local climate and land use plans that actually incorporate that relocation or buyout component. So community-driven participation of course, helps to foster that social cohesion, but also adaptation plans can engage in local discussion on buyout program design. So we found using roundtables or engagement forums are probably the best mediums to strengthen those relationships. One thing that's kind of been said before is the availability of a federal funding on a rolling basis would enable municipalities and provinces to actually engage residences in buyouts sufficiently. And the last two recommendations that we kind of saw was this need for generating greater clarity on roles, responsibilities, and expectations from both local and provincial levels of government was an important avenue, again, for fostering accountability and transparency in the program. From an administration standpoint, we found that having a clear division of responsibilities, either between the municipal government and the provincial government, to coordinate efforts would also minimize overlap and duplication. Lastly, we found that coordinating a buyout program with existing flood risk reduction policies, either within the province, would improve the effectiveness of the plan by ensuring that the burdens and benefits were equally distributed throughout the community. We found that local buyout programs should link to existing provincial DFA programs, as is the case in Quebec. It's linked to their disaster financial assistance program to actually avoid, again, that cross-purpose or duplication. One thing that resonated throughout a lot of this research was that we found that those who were making the sacrifice of relocation should know that their effort contributes to meaningful reduction of risk. Just want to end off with a survey participant quote here. Not only does proactive planning help foster relationships in the community and among levels of government, but it builds trust, ensures local people have full access to necessary information and are ready to make well-informed decisions when the time comes. I'm going to hand it over back to Brent, where he's going to be giving an outline of planned retreat approaches to support resilience to climate change in Canada, which is a report that he worked on for Natural Resources Canada.
Okay, thanks, Shaieree. And Keith, I'm going to go through this quickly so that we still have time for Q&A. Okay, you're seeing the correct slides, the full slides? Yes, okay. This was an NRCan consulting report that I worked on along with other members of Jevity Consulting, and I'll skip to the good part. We really tried to focus on what we called good practices, recognizing that best practices are very hard to come by in such a contextualized climate change adaptation tool like Managed Retreat. So we use the terms good practices, and we focused on good practices related to communication surrounding managed retreat projects, the governance of those projects, and especially the process by which communities are engaged and really are steering the process in their own communities. The link, you can either just Google the report title here or the link, which will be available when the PowerPoint slides are shared sometime next week. I just wanted to mention that we really tried to focus on the issue of proactivity versus reactive retreat, and we think this is really could be embedded in cycles of discussion with community surrounding climate change resilience and climate change adaptation, where retreat is just one of the climate change adaptation tools in the toolbox that you discuss with communities. But by normalizing the idea that this is one of the tools in the toolbox, I think communities can begin to look at this as a more future-oriented strategy. So that's part of this report. The last thing that I'll mention is a recent, well, it was funded a year ago now, a funded research project called Retreating from Risk, Decision Supports for the Equitable Implementation of Retreat to Build Climate Resilience. And this is a project funded by the Canadian funding agency, NFRF. It's a $2.5 million project with some funding coming from our United States partners and funding coming from Partners for Action to help with especially project management. And it's a 3-country project, Canada, USA, and Indonesia, all of which are facing managed retreat in multiple case studies. So it's a typical research project where graduate students would be involved, perhaps selecting an individual case. And then as those cases, as the research gets completed, we begin to do cross-case analyses on particular themes, such as equity or lack of equity. And equity is built right into the title of the projects, and so that's a key concern for the managed retreat cases that we're looking at. And we're starting from a community level because this is where managed retreat is being applied. And you need to have a contextualized approach that reflects the community that you're considering retreat for. We're also increasingly promoting the idea that communities should lead these projects, at least in the design phases. And by leading in design, you're actually achieving better political feasibility as well. The other part of this project is really helping communities through the many decisions that are needed in order to push forward a managed retreat project. It's a 4-year project, and towards the second half of this project, we'll be connecting with municipalities across Canada, firstly to decide what kind of support do communities need, and secondly, how can communities feed into the design of these supports. This, spaghetti spiderweb diagram is just an ongoing effort by researchers in the project to really map out all of the different decisions that are needed And the next phase of this spaghetti diagram is to really come up with perhaps core decisions that are needed at the start, and then related decisions that flow later on down the road. But our question here is asking, how can this project support communities make those decisions? And at that, I will stop and turn the floor over to Keith for the Q&A.
Great.
I also have a few last slides. Sorry, Keith, but happy to turn it over in a minute. So thank you to those of you who already skipped ahead, because I see, now where did it go? We've got just one last Menti poll for you, which somehow has disappeared from my sharing notes. But some of you are in Menti, and I can see that here we go. Just like Brent, you wanted the slide, the knowledge has increased. So thank you everyone for being here today and for engaging and for all of your questions. And it's really great to see that some of you have gained some knowledge, which is great, through listening to this webinar. And we really have to thank Nikki and Keith as well. Nikki, for all of the logistics. We had a few questions like, what do you think are the main challenges to implementing managed retreat? But I think I'll just ask the one question, which is, what are your key takeaways or priorities that you feel you have after this presentation? So what do you think needs to be addressed in order to implement managed retreat in Canada for resilient communities?
Great, and while people are responding to your question, Sharmalene, I'll pose one or two of my own, and then repeat some of the questions that were posted into the Q&A. ICLR's audience is largely insurers. What do you think the proper role of insurers is in promoting or funding a buyout program?
I can take an initial stab at that. I think the issue of flexibility for insurance payouts is actually going to help both insurance companies and the private homeowner. If homeowners can make that decision how they're going to use their insurance payout to go forward in a way that is best for them, and if that includes the option of relocation to a safer location, then I assume that also helps the insurance company. And so I think it's kind of this, the overlapping Venn diagram, or the meeting of minds, where retreat might be in the best interest of both those parties. So it comes down to flexibility, I think, at least my initial response.
Shaieree, Sharmalene, do you have a...
I was just going to add that with whatever the policies say can incentivize people towards or away from different decisions. And so I think just like Brent was saying and Shaieree, being able to align policies and what you're actually allowing for to whatever federal and provincial and local programs there are, that really can help. So everyone has a part to play in shifting these systems so that people do end up not only building back better, but building back better in safer locations in a climate projected future. Go ahead, Shaieree.
Thanks, Sharmalene. I'm just going to add, and probably sound like a broken record at this point, but definitely having transparency built in into some of these insurance policies so that homeowners are aware of I live in a risk, whether if it's deemed as high, medium, or low, like knowing your risk. So that's the first aspect. Understand that risk and understand that, yes, I may be eligible for a buyout offer. One thing that we saw in previous case studies was, giving, if that homeowner is afforded the flexibility to actually move, allowing that, giving them funds to cover their existing mortgage, and so they can move elsewhere. A lot of the times, these policies allow you to rebuild on the same property, but maybe 10 feet back. So that's not really helping anyone. It's you're kind of exacerbating that risk. Or the homeowner may decide in a couple of years, like, I'm going to sell this home and transfer that risk to somebody else. So it's just limiting the transfer of risk and that liability that comes with that. So yeah, definitely accountability, transparency, and kind of just understand the risk from the homeowner's perspective.
Great. And I'm going to have one more question before I want to pose other people's questions. When will we have or do we have a map or other geographic criteria that says where buyouts make more financial sense than elevations or wet flood proofing or the other flood mitigation options?
That sounds like a Partners for Action question. Is this could be one of the future projects that Partners for Action or other similar research centers take on?
I don't know. I think that's a tough one because there's different types of flooding, and we all know the inputs that you put into models, what you choose to put into those models can greatly, influence your results. So I'm not sure how to answer that. I guess that I think that is a bigger question, right? Because there's different types of flooding. There's the mitigations against the flood mitigation measures. So like Shaieree was talking about, at a local, very local level, there would be a need for mapping with the stormwater management master plan on top of fluvial and coastal exposure on top of whatever other types of mitigations that are put into place at the community level. But then even at the very, very local household level, there are just so many variables. So to me, I don't actually know, but I would be really interested. I think that's a very good question. What do you think, Shaieree?
Yeah, I'll be very diplomatic and punt it and say that I think it's we definitely need cohesion in the way, whether this is something that research institutes take on or municipal, provincial governments take on to map their risk. In Ontario, we have conservation authorities who do that work as well. And so I think just aligning some of the information that's already out there, because a lot of the times different tiers of governments are displaying different pieces of information. And again, that can create some lack of misinformation out there. So really just alignment of information.
And also, I mean, we really do lack, I've been wishing for what is the climate projected flood map that integrates different types of flooding. And that is consistent, like Shaieree was saying, because for instance, conservation authorities might use, I can't remember, Hurricane Sandy, 50-year flood, historical data just for the floodplain. There's how do you integrate the different types of flood mapping to get at this question of what would make sense at a property level?
So it sounds like we're not there now, and we're not close to being there with a clear map that says here buyouts and there do elevations and the other place do something else. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, NRCan has the FIMP program, Flood Hazard Identification Mapping Program, something, and there's a flood portal coming. So I think that there is a recognition for better data and more accessible data. There's the Climate Access or climatedata.ca. I can never remember the sites, but there are now more resources that can help inform that type of decision making.
Thank you. I'm going to pose the questions that have been posted into the Q&A box, starting with Louis Poirier's question. Can you speak to the differences in the application of managed retreat in Gatineau versus Bay St. Paul? What can we learn by comparing these two events?
Maybe I'll take a quick stab, and then Brent, if you want to follow up.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the Bay St. Paul example, but yeah, take a jump at Gatineau.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with Bain St. Paul either, but given that in Quebec, the Quebec government was responsible or the designated authority for the buyout program, when it comes to compensation caps and administration, I suspect it probably would have been a standardized approach across the province. The way implementation occurred in each community obviously will be different depending on how many buyouts were targeted, the eligibility, if the community ended up taking mitigation efforts at the local level. So maybe if it was near the river, they put some, designated homeowners in Gatineau, for example, we saw actually put up property level mitigations, the ones that were not eligible for the buyouts or may have not wanted to participate in the buyout. So we really saw like a mixed approach to how homeowners were implementing mitigation at the local level and even way the municipality was administering the program. Of course, in Gatineau, I can say that the program got pushback initially, but after the subsequent floods, we really saw a narrative change, and people who in the first cycle of buyouts may not have been eligible or didn't really want to participate. We saw that there was a higher uptake in the second round. And that can be attributed, obviously, to this idea that they were still kind of reeling from the first effect of the flood and trying to see how they can, take what they can and kind of retreat. One thing that we can definitively say is, at least in Gatineau, most people who did take the buyout, we have heard from participants or interviewers that those folks have remained in nearby jurisdictions. So they didn't up and leave somewhere really far. But of course, we know that some were unable to cover their mortgages. So, maybe they were a homeowner before, but now they're in a state of renting. So it really kind of begs to the question of equity when you think about these cases. Like, are we, offering appropriate compensation? Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else anyone else wants to add.
Well, one thing I could mention is because most managed retreat projects are implemented post-disaster, there's a pressure or I think a natural focus at the homeowner level. And if you were to design a managed retreat program or project ahead of time, you could build in other benefits to the community, such as the post-retreat use of the land, which could be highly beneficial for recreation, for nature-based solutions, for green space, and all of that adds to the benefits of that project from a cost-benefit perspective. So you might end up with actually a higher benefit-cost ratio in a proactive sense. So I think those are some of the opportunities for thinking longer term and building that into a climate change resilience community vision.
Thanks. David Harper asks, are there examples of retreating structures, say, from farmland, while retaining other uses, say, flood-tolerant crop production?
Yes, if we look around the world, there's a lot of examples of that, especially in places where that farmland is linear or it extends back from the coastline and the topography is fairly steep. So it just makes sense to retreat the valuable assets to a higher elevation back from, say, a coast or a river, and life goes on for farming. You continue to harvest crops during the good years, and maybe you lose a crop to flood 1 year out of 10. But there are many examples of that worldwide.
Maybe I'll just highlight, there is a example close to home. The case of Truro in Nova Scotia, they actually underwent dike realignment, and there was a lot of benefits to protect vital infrastructure, agriculture, and residential and commercial space there. So maybe I'll drop a link in the chat about some more information about Truro's dike realignment that they did. I think it happened in the past decade or so, so it's still fairly recent.
Thanks. Our friend Slobodan Simonovic asks, managed retreat as a risk reduction measure has been known and considered for a long time. However, the main issues that are affecting the efficacy of managed retreat are, and he gives a short list here, 1, human behavior, the relationship to water, and 2, dynamic character of flood hazard determination reflected in changes of flood protection criteria. He says that based on his personal experience, with the 1997 flood of the century on the Red River in Manitoba and the 2013 flood in Alberta. Sorry, those two observations were based on his personal experience with those two floods. His question is, how do you see your innovative managed retreat deal with these two important issues? Again, they're human behavior and dynamic character of flood hazard determination.
Well, human behavior, I think, is confounding when it comes to managed retreat, and you can never look at a community and say that you understand its behavior because it's made up of individuals, and individuals have very strong bonds to location, place attachment, while others are, willing to accept an equal or even better alternative as long as somebody else will pay for that, and then everything in between. And so, human behavior, I think, is at the center of trying to design an equitable managed retreat process. I think it might be impossible to satisfy 100% of your community because of those differences in behavior. But generally speaking, we know that a process that is more engaging of community is much more likely to lead to acceptability. And the more that you can at least be seen to be handing over decisions to communities, I think that accords more with people's behaviors. So it's a power sharing approach that we tend to promote as good practice. And I have never seen a researcher argue against public engagement for managed retreat. It seems to be the one item that everybody agrees on. As for the dynamic nature of flooding, well, that's a very challenging question, and I think that's why we see managed retreat programs applied to geophysical hazard, because they're much more they're easier to be able to say with a high degree of probability this is likely to happen based on our geophysical understanding. Much more difficult when you have a watershed that is undergoing land use change and population dynamic changes and climate change all at the same time. And you have fluid government policies that are affecting watershed characteristics. So very dynamic and very hard to map, as your first question was indicating. How do we map all of those changeable items 50 years into the future?
Right.
If I might add to the human behavior element, I think there are choices that some people can make and others that it's out of their control or their options are more limited. So I'm also aware that the onus can't just be on individual households and trying to motivate their behavior. It's a bigger issue than that. And so yes, community engagement, but also to find out what are the needs and what are the options available to people and how to actually support people differently, because otherwise you're just serving the people who have the time and the money and the loudest voices and the connections.
And that sort of transitions well into the next question from Sue Baker. She asks about owner versus renter occupied properties. She asked the very specific question: in the cases that were studied, is there information that would show percentage of properties that were tenanted rather than owner occupied? But her question also raises the question: how do you do managed retreat in a way that responds to the needs of renters?
Excellent question. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe I'll take a stab. The first part of that question, so we did anecdotally, we found that many of these case studies actually did have a big tenant population. And so, that's an entirely new population that gets displaced, specifically in communities where it's a 0% vacancy rate that brings to kind of loops and questions about housing and affordability, et cetera. But what we found was when it came to tenant versus homeowners, so buyout programs and policies are, historically been developed for people who own single primary residences. It's not really targeted for the tenant. A lot of provincial governments will defer to their disaster financial assistance for tenants. So that's something that is eligible, that tenants can, if you've lost contents in a flood and anything that's been damaged, you could kind of get some funds back from the provincial DFA program, but there is, not in Canada at least, I have not come across any documented cases where like buyouts have been targeted for tenants because there is no ownership over that property or the land that that property sits on.
And with that, I'm going to bring our conversation to a close. Shaieree, Cottar, Brent Doberstein, Sharmalene, Mendis-Millard of University of Waterloo, and Partners for Action, thank you so much for a wonderful, engaging talk. We had a lot more questions than we had time to address, and that's always a good sign. I want to remind our attendees that next month on May 9th, Professor Matthew Bourbonnais of University of British Columbia will present research on real-time monitoring and prediction of wildfire risk for response and mitigation. And our today's speaker's slide deck will be available by Monday morning, along with video of this webinar. Thanks everyone for attending, and I hope you have a great weekend.
Thanks very much
Thank
for
you.
hosting, Keith.
Thank you.
And thank
Thanks
you,
so much
ICLR.
again.
Thanks, everyone.